Good evening, and thank you for joining me. Tonight, our focus is on a story that is shaping politics, diplomacy, and the global economy all at once: tariffs, sanctions, and President Donald Trump's escalating trade offensive. In just the past few days, we have seen Trump warn Russia that his patience with Vladimir Putin is, quote, running out fast. He has threatened Moscow with new economic sanctions targeting banks and oil exports. At the same time, he has called on the G7 to impose what he calls meaningful tariffs on China and India for purchasing Russian crude, and has suggested the European Union should go as far as slapping 100% tariffs on New Delhi and Beijing. On top of all this, the United States Supreme Court has agreed to fast-track a case that will decide whether Trump's tariffs are even legal, with a ruling that could force the Treasury to refund tens of billions of dollars. This is an extraordinary moment, and over the next 30 minutes I want to unpack what it means, why it matters, and where it could lead. Let's begin with Trump's warning to Moscow. In a Fox News interview, he made it clear that his patience with Putin is exhausted. The direct quote was that his patience is running out fast, and he promised that sanctions would hit very hard, targeting banks, oil, and tariffs too. This language is not casual. When the United States sanctions Russian banks, it cuts them off from dollar transactions and strangles their access to international finance. When it restricts oil, it goes after the single largest source of revenue for the Russian state. These are tools designed to hurt, and the timing shows Trump's frustration that efforts to mediate ceasefire talks in Ukraine have gone nowhere. Western diplomats say Moscow is refusing meaningful concessions while Kyiv insists a ceasefire must come with Russian withdrawal. In that deadlock, Trump is turning back to economic pressure. But here's the complication: sanctioning Russian oil doesn't just hurt Moscow. It also ripples through the energy markets, because countries like China and India have been buying that oil at discounted prices. And that is where the next layer of this story unfolds. The U.S. Treasury has now urged the G7, America's closest partners in Europe and Asia, to join Washington in hitting China and India with what officials call meaningful tariffs. The logic is straightforward from Trump's point of view: if Beijing and New Delhi keep buying from Moscow, they are undermining the sanctions campaign, so they should pay a price when selling their own goods into Western markets. According to the Financial Times, Trump has asked the EU to consider tariffs as high as 100%. Imagine doubling the cost of Chinese and Indian imports overnight. The political message would be loud and clear, but the economic consequences could be severe. For European consumers, it would mean higher prices for everything from electronics to clothing. For American businesses, it could mean disrupted supply chains and retaliation from both Beijing and New Delhi. Still, Trump's strategy is unmistakable. He is using tariffs not just as an economic tool but as a weapon of foreign policy, a way to pressure countries that are not fully aligned with Washington's approach to Russia. This brings us to India's delicate position. On one side, Trump has announced that the United States and India have agreed to resume trade negotiations, talks that have been on hold after disputes over tariffs and market access. Washington has long sought deeper economic ties with New Delhi, both as a counterweight to China and as a partner in technology, defense, and energy. On the other side, India has continued purchasing Russian crude, often at discounted prices, because its fast-growing economy needs reliable and affordable energy. For Prime Minister Modi, this is a balancing act. He wants strong ties with Washington, but he also cannot ignore domestic needs at home. If Trump escalates with tariffs on India, the strain on US-India relations could be significant. New Delhi may resist what it sees as heavy-handed pressure, or it may try to negotiate carve-outs. Either way, India's role is central in this unfolding trade story. China's reaction has been equally sharp. Beijing issued a stern warning to Mexico, telling it to think twice before imposing tariffs, a clear sign of how seriously it takes this moment. Why Mexico? Because Mexico announced that it will raise tariffs on automobiles from China and other Asian nations to 50%. That is an enormous increase, and it aligns Mexico more closely with Washington's protectionist approach. But it also risks retaliation from Beijing. China has multiple levers it could use: restricting imports from Mexico, slowing investment, or using diplomatic pressure across Latin America. The fact that China responded so directly shows that it views these moves not just as economic measures but as geopolitical maneuvers against its interests. And then there is the legal front here in the United States. The Supreme Court has agreed to take up a high-stakes challenge to Trump's tariffs, with oral arguments set for November and a ruling possible by the end of the year. This case matters enormously because if the court rules against the administration, the Treasury could be forced to refund half of the tariff revenue collected so far. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has already warned that this could amount to tens of billions of dollars. Lower courts, including a federal appeals court and the Court of International Trade, have found that Trump exceeded his authority in imposing many of these tariffs. Their view is that such sweeping duties are a power reserved for Congress, not the president acting alone. Trump and his team argue the opposite, insisting that national security and trade statutes give the executive branch broad discretion. If the Supreme Court sides with him, presidential power in trade will be strengthened dramatically. If not, not only could tariffs collapse, but existing trade deals with the EU, Japan, and South Korea may have to be renegotiated. The uncertainty alone is already rattling markets. The global fallout is hard to miss. Markets are uneasy. Investors worry that tariffs will feed inflation by raising the cost of imported goods. Businesses fear supply chain disruptions, especially in automobiles, electronics, and energy. Europe faces the prospect of higher consumer prices if it follows Trump's lead on China and India. Mexico risks losing access to the Chinese market after its 50% tariff hike. India faces the tightrope of keeping U.S. relations strong while still securing cheap energy from Russia. And China faces the possibility of another bruising trade war with Washington, this time even broader than before. Add to that the looming Supreme Court case, and you have a world watching closely, wondering if Trump's tariff strategy will stand or collapse. So where does that leave us tonight? In just a few weeks, we've gone from stalled ceasefire talks in Ukraine to threats of crushing sanctions on Russia, demands for tariffs on China and India, Mexico raising duties on Chinese cars, and the Supreme Court setting the stage for a showdown over the legality of Trump's policies. The bigger question is not just whether tariffs will stand, but what kind of world economy we are heading into. Is Washington prepared to weaponize trade across multiple fronts at once? Can it pressure India and China without fracturing alliances? And what happens if the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's approach, forcing refunds and upending existing agreements? These are not small questions. They cut to the heart of America's role in the global system. One thing is certain: trade is no longer a dry subject for economists. It is now the battlefield where geopolitics, economics, and law collide. Tonight we are watching that battlefield shift in real time. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive. However the Supreme Court rules, however China and India respond, and however Trump presses forward, the world's trading system is about to face one of its most important tests in decades.